Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Dolly the sheep. We had to start this list off with Dolly today because she really set the stage for everything on this list to come. You may have heard of Dolly the sheep before, and that is because she made history in 1996 when she was born. This is because she was the very first mammal to be cloned from an adult somatic cell. The process of cloning to create her involved nuclear transfer from a cell taken from the mammary gland. Basically, they transferred the nucleus from the adult cell into an unfertilized premature egg that had its nucleus removed, and boom, cloned sheep. This was huge for the scientific community because of the fact that it not only showed that cloning can be successful in mammals, but also because it showed that a cloned organism can be produced from a mature cell from a specific body part. While Dolly made history, she also sadly only lived a relatively short life. She ended up being euthanized just before her 7th birthday because of the fact that she had a progressive lung disease as well as arthritis, both of which are said not to be linked to her cloning origins. I guess it's kind of cool that Dolly existed, and the fact that we have these scientific abilities is amazing, but there's also something pretty ominous about it. I just hope we use these powers to do things like bringing back extinct animals, maybe, rather than some weird, mad scientist type of stuff. In our number 9 spot today, we have Samrupa. After the birth of Dolly the sheep, scientists everywhere began trying their hand at cloning, and that is when Samrupa was born. Back in 2009, Samrupa was born in India and was a Murrah buffalo, which is known as being the best known milking buffalo, since these animals can be capable of producing 35 kilograms of milk a day. The birth of Samrupa marked a breakthrough in the country because it put India on the map as one of the few countries at the time who had the capabilities to clone, and this was all done using a new at the time landmark technique which was called hand-guided cloning. The scientists who helped to create Samrupa worked on the calf for 4 years, so it's clear that they were all very excited about its birth. Unfortunately, however, shortly after Samrupa's birth, things went seriously wrong. Just 5 days after birth, Samrupa unfortunately succumbed to a lung infection and passed away. While the scientists weren't able to save the animal, it is very clear that its birth and short life helped scientists in remarkable ways that went on to inform them in future experiments and projects. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Pyrenean ibex. The Pyrenean ibex is an animal that went extinct around 2000. In a horrible turn of events, the last one was a female named Celia, and she was killed in an awful falling tree incident. A subspecies of the Spanish ibex, the Pyrenean ibex were native to the Pyrenees Mountains on the border of Spain and France. Back in the medieval ages, their population was reduced drastically to an endangered level. This is due to 2 things: being hunted as well as the spread of human disease. Flash forward to 2003, however, and scientists tried to bring them back to life. This is the first extinct creatures that scientists ever tried to clone. That is absolutely crazy. For 7 minutes. DNA from Celia, the last living individual of the species, was taken and implanted into the womb of a domestic goat. From here, the clone was in fact born, but due to lung complications was unable to survive for longer than 7 minutes. It was a short life, but a monumental one that definitely broke new ground in the scientific world. In our number 7 spot today, we have Garima 1. Garima is similar to Samrupa that we already talked about, and in fact she was born in the same place, the National Dairy Research Institute, just shortly after Samrupa, and luckily her birth did end up being more successful considering she made it past the first year of life. She was actually cloned on June 6th, 2009, and things seemed to be going quite well until around June and July of 2011. Garima was created through the same hand-guided cloning technique as Samrupa, so it's clear that the technique was evolving and getting better, but things still unfortunately went awry. When things took a turn for the worst, doctors struggled to figure out exactly what was the problem, but eventually it was revealed that her problem was with her heart. Researchers revealed that her heart was abnormally overweight and much larger in size than other buffaloes her same age, and this likely led to the complications she faced that sadly culminated in her passing in August of 2011. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Argali. In the earlier days of cloning experiments, scientists attempted to clone an Argali, which is also known as a type of mountain sheep. These sheep are known to roam the highlands of Western East Asia, the Himalayas, Tibet, and the Altai Mountains. The reason they wanted to clone these sheep is because they are important to the ecosystems they live in, and unfortunately they are a threatened species. Now, I know there's controversy over the cloning of threatened or extinct species, but personal opinions aside, they were making this attempt to see if this could be a viable way to potentially save a species. Unfortunately, however, these attempts would prove to be futile. Using the same techniques used in the instance of Dolly the sheep, the somatic cell nuclear transfer, while they believed it would be promising, all attempts to clone the mammal failed to produce any viable results, and thus modern science wasn't able to assist in the continuation of this species. But in good news, while the species is still threatened, it is still around and not quite endangered, although its life is mainly threatened due to trophy hunters and ranchers. In our number 5 spot today we have the gar. A gar is a species of wild cattle that is native to South Asia and Southeast Asia, and unfortunately they are listed as a vulnerable species on the IUCN Red List, and they have been since 1986. This is exactly why, in 2001, scientists decided it was time to try and clone one. With a population that has declined over 70% in the last 3 generations, they seemed like a perfect candidate to become the first ever endangered species to be cloned. In 2001, at the Trans-Ova Genetics Center in Sioux Center, Iowa, they were able to birth a clone gar. They obviously used gar DNA, but used a domestic cow as a surrogate mother to carry the clone. This of course was a huge breakthrough, but unfortunately the life of the gar was cut short as the calf passed away within 48 hours of its birth. Although this is obviously terrible, I guess the upside is that it is believed that the calf passed due to dysentery, which is not thought to have been related to the cloning process, which does mean that although the outcome wasn't as predicted or hoped, the cloning could still be considered a success. In our number 4 spot today we have Injaz. With a name that means achievement, she clearly was exactly that, because Injaz was the first camel clone ever produced. She was born back in 2009 at the Camel Reproduction Center in Dubai, and she certainly was a proud accomplishment for all of those who worked to create and raise her. In fact, the cloning of Injaz was such a success that she lived for over a decade. Her birth prompted the center to continue cloning camels, which they did about 20 to 25 times a year in the time after Injaz was born. She broke ground once again when she proved that cloned camels could in fact conceive and give birth naturally, and she did so a few times, but in the end it would be this that led to her demise. On her 4th calf, as she carried it, it grew to be too big for her to carry, which unfortunately led to dystocia late in her pregnancy. Scientists did their best to save her, but unfortunately they lost both of them. Everyone who worked to care for Injaz was rightfully extremely upset at her passing, but they clearly used her and her success as a starting point for what was to come. Now the center is turning out dozens of cloned camels every year, some going for $55,000. Not sure how I feel about that, but you know, whatever. In our number 3 spot today we have the Bantang. Back in 2003, scientists at the Advanced Cell Technology of Worcester, Massachusetts were ecstatic when they successfully birthed a clone Bantang, which is an endangered species of cattle. To do this, they actually took frozen tissues from a male of the species that passed away many years earlier in 1980. They used these skin cells and inserted the nuclei into cow eggs, and a cow was used as a surrogate mother. They attempted this with 16 pregnancies, 2 of which came to term. With the success of one clone did come the birth of another identical twin who was born to a different cow mother, but despite being carried to term and birth, this clone was not as expected. It was twice the normal birth weight, which quickly proved to be a very negative sign. As for the clone who was considered a success, it was hand-raised at the San Diego Wild Animal Park's Infant Isolation Unit. Unfortunately, however, due to an injury that the animal got when it was less than 7 years old, it did end up passing away, which meant that sadly the clone only lasted for about half the expected lifespan for this species of animal. In our number 2 spot today we have the woolly mammoth. We would certainly be missing a very important animal on this list if we didn't include the woolly mammoth. These guys were of course a species of mammoth, and in fact they were one of the last in line of the mammoth species. Because of the fact that in both Alaska and Siberia there were frozen carcasses discovered, they're actually one of the most well-studied extinct creatures. Exactly why or how they were driven to extinction is widely debated, and another thing people like to debate is whether or not we should try and bring them back. There was a genome project completed in 2015, and since then it has been proposed the species could be revived through a few different means, but no one has yet taken the leap. Here's the thing though, there's a new company that is pretty set on de-extincting woolly mammoth, and they have a new investor. This investor is called In-Q-Tel, and they are registered as a non-profit venture capital firm that is funded by the CIA. They claim that the interest in this company is less about mammoths and more about the capability to do such crazy projects. I know this is more like a future project that might happen, but when we're talking about a huge animal like the woolly mammoth, we have to bring it up. Okay, I live in Canada. That's where the woolly mammoth would also live. I feel like. I don't know. I feel like it just has consequences for me, so I'm concerned. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Morian viviparous tree snail. This was a species of air-breathing tropical land snails that were endemic to French Polynesia, and their near extinction was caused by a chain of events that happened after something humans did. The African land snail was introduced into Tahiti in 1967 as a food source, but it quickly escaped and began to destroy crops. Biologists wanted to attempt to control the African land snail, so they decided to introduce the rosy wolf snail to the area in 1977. This went absolutely haywire, as the rosy wolf snail didn't just control the population of African land snails, but rather started to eradicate all of the snails that were native to the area, which of course includes our little friend. So this one little introduction led to them being totally extinct in the wild. These snails still exist in captivity, and there have been attempts to re-release them into the wild, maybe clone them to boost their population numbers, but unfortunately the rosy wolf snail continues to prey upon them, so at this point researchers are unsure if it will ever be possible for them to live in the wild again.
Kicking off the list at number 10, the aviator suit. When it comes to new ideas and new inventions, it almost seems messy at first, all the time. It's always a horrible start. And today's list is quite messy, a lot of horrible experiments done with groups of unaware subjects. To kick this grim one off, we'll look back to the early 1900s. We'll start with Franz Reichelt, a known inventor of the time. He invented his own version of a wearable aviator suit. It was a parachute. It was made of 320 square feet of fabric. It wasn't light at all. And in 1912, Franz wanted to test this new invention out in public, but instead of using a dummy and throwing that off the Eiffel Tower, Franz wanted to be brave and he strapped himself in. And the rest is history. Dark, horrible fast history. Number 9. The Hoffling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966, so a bit more recent, in a time where the rules of psychological experiments, well, didn't really exist. Really. I was gonna say they were kind of loose, but no, they were not really a thing at all. Because of this, the nurses that were all part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays is totally illegal, very illegal. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher in this scenario. He would ask the nurses to check the medical cabinet to see if they had a drug called Astrotin, which was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment, and it was actually just a placebo, so don't worry too much. The Astrogen would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign the papers later and all that jazz. This just had to get done that night. This had to be delivered to the patient ASAP. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. Big 2. And it was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be used in the hospital in the first place. Big 3 red flags right there. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them went to administer this. Yeah, big oof on that one. Yikes. To be fair, that's the entire point of this test. This is nothing towards the nurses. I'm not ripping on them at all. I mean, this was 1966. We didn't know quite a bit back in the day, you know what I mean? This really showed the pressure nurses are put under randomly in the middle of the night, if anything. Number 8, UCLA schizophrenia experiment. Starting in 1983, UCLA researchers Michael Gitlin and Keith Neutraline went to great and pretty unethical lengths just to see how people who are suffering from schizophrenia relapse. Yeah, basically they're trying to figure out if there is a way to predict the relapse, or a psychosis episode of some sorts. Now, sounds like a good idea on paper, I guess, but the way you go about things, historically, come on, we could have done a lot better. Unfortunately, this experiment involved recruiting hundreds of participants who were all being treated for schizophrenia at the time, and then just taking them off their meds completely. Yeah, as I said that, you at home probably went, ooh, yeah, that's exactly right. What a horrible idea. Like, we're going the opposite way here. We're not supposed to do this, right? There's no suitable plan in order for when they could return to their medication. And they also didn't do a good job making sure these patients were actually safe during these experiments. They're like, yeah, let's just take people off their meds, see what happens. It's horrible, it's one of the worst. Unfortunately, the results were as bad as you thought and proved to be fatal when one of the participants, Antonio Lamadrid, ended up taking his own life. Again, not sure what we expected here in this sense. An article from 1994 also said the doctors failed to get proper consent from the patients as well. Just a cherry on top of this horrible experiment. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse. There you go. Number 7. Psychic driving. British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron is to blame for this one. Remember that name. Don't listen to anything he says. He created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting, to say the least. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous, repeated audio loop of something that's intended to change their behavior. Just the same line or the same whatever over and over thousands of times. And through the course of their treatment, they would also be paralyzed while being exposed to the loop message. Yeah, the worst thing ever, right? So the CIA heard about this and started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a fake name. Classic CIA. Cameron would subject patients to paralytics and electroconvulsive therapy, stronger than usual as well, just to make things worse, just at a horrible limit. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute for more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents' names and thought that the interrogators were actually their real parents. Just horrible things. Their minds were just so confused. Brutal stuff. Number 6, Go Pills. Here in Toronto, we have Go trains, Go buses, but not Go pills. Not yet. Hopefully not ever, actually. Yeah, move over 5-hour energy. We got some competition on the horizon. Staying awake is challenging, even when you're doing something you absolutely enjoy, like watching a movie. You'll still fall asleep. It just happens, we're human. My dad fell asleep in a theater once in the moving chairs. I couldn't believe it. Guy's 3D glasses were falling off of his face. I was in shock. But he works a lot. He works crazy hours, he's older. That's where Go Pills were supposed to come in handy. Workers who have these long shifts and work late hours to pay the bills. This pill was supposed to keep you up for 40 hours straight, so a bit much, I'd say. The US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, which is much less air coming out of my mouth, is currently funding this pill. But what if it's mistreated? I can't even begin to imagine the negative effects something like this could have on people. We could barely handle Tide Pods as a community. You know what I mean? It's kind of a bad idea, I vote. Number 5. The Milgram experiment. When learning about our past in further detail, like the Trinity test for example, and how that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's important to understand why these things happened and why these people did this, or more so how people are influenced into doing these horrible things historically, especially in large numbers. So the Milgram experiment was put in place to get an idea. How far will people go when it comes to obeying instructions, specifically if it involves a third party being hurt? Well, Stanley Milgram, Yale psychologist, created this test. There's 3 important roles for this one. You need the teacher, the experimenter, and the learner. The learner is disguised as the main test subject, but really, they're actually in on the whole thing. The real subject is over here. The teacher, the one administering pain to the test subjects. So they're told by this higher figure, whoever, to keep upping the pain every time they get a question wrong. They're like the rule maker. So the real test here is to see how far humans will go when hurting others under direct authority. It's important to note that the subject also isn't actually getting shocked at all. Again, they're in on it. They play it up. They play it up more and more just to see what's going on. These tests were underway in 1961 in a basement at Yale University. In college, I did improv. That's wild. That's a wild after-school curricular activity. Number 4, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrible experiments during World War II that certainly are going to shock anyone who learns about them. This is wild. This definitely belongs on this list. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was horrible and extremely inhumane, as are most of these things. Different medical schools and universities all provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments. Big group effort, nice, way to go guys. They used both prisoners and civilians as test subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens like cholera or anthrax, or operations with just no anesthesia, just weapon testing, all painful stuff, really the worst of the worst. Number 3, MK Ultra. We have to include a mind control project. Do you believe in mind control? Some claim they're born with it, like an X-Men, so if that's you, you know where to meet. MK Ultra, where do I start? Okay, it was originally a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973, where they ran hundreds of experiments to US citizens. They gave them hallucinogens in an attempt to crack mind control, or sorry, as they called it, information gathering. Yeah, it's like what Apple says. Oh, we're just gathering information. Yeah, okay. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, Chinese, and/or North Korean agents were all using mind control in the war. That was their best explanation towards these brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea at the time. Yeah, it's gotta be brainwashing, nothing else, right? Horrible tests were being conducted in universities, hospitals, and again, in prisons. The happenings of these projects weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended. It was a huge, horrible secret. The agency destroyed most MK documents back in 1973 when it officially ended, so we think we know when in reality we probably know little to nothing what actually occurred. Number 2. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Perhaps the most famous psychological experiment gone wrong. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Let's talk about it. It started August 14th, 1971. It was led by university psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. Again, another university study. My gosh. I mean, to be fair, Hogwarts was also messed up, but Hogwarts wasn't real now, was it? The Stanford Prison Experiment was very real. The experiment took volunteers and divided them into 2 groups. One group of prisoners and one group of guards. And they placed all these volunteers into a fake prison that was created for the experiment, okay? The experiment aimed to see if and how quickly humans would turn evil, under the right conditions of course, with the right amount of power. Yeah, pretty twisted, right? It's basically a group version of the Milgram experiment. It was a test to try and answer the question of if humans are inherently good or inherently evil. And after just 6 days, we found out. Yeah, 6 days later, the experiment needed to be concluded because the guards began absolutely tormenting the prisoners in the worst ways possible. It really showed the kinds of things humans can be capable of, even after just a short amount of time, less than a week. And humans are like, oh, I'll be evil. And finally, coming in number 1, facial expressions experiment. Yep, a wild one to close her off. The facial expressions experiment. Okay, back in 1924, a psychologist with, you guessed it, the University of Minnesota, classic university stuff, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say sounds a little silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were all the exact same. Does happiness look the same on everybody? Does sadness? What about fear or shock, disgust, anger? What about those? So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. And then he exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions. He wanted to compare all these results side by side. The stimuli at hand was intense. This guy wanted big reactions. He included showing them adult films, he exposed them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course horrible things that I can't talk about here on the tube of you. You know what I mean? Horrible stuff. All in the name of facial expressions. What an awful experiment. What a dark one.
In our number 10 spot, we have the hepatitis outbreak. Allegedly, in the 50s, there was a New York state-run institution for mentally handicapped young ones called Willowbrook State School, and it unfortunately was known for its uncleanliness, and as a result, the school had an outbreak of hepatitis. A doctor got wind of what was going on in that school, and he created an experiment that would assist in developing a vaccine. The only problem is the experiment would involve deliberately infecting the young ones with the disease. Horrible. His name was Dr. Sewell Krugman. The experiment received a lot of attention from the media, but the parents signed permission slips, so people let it go, unfortunately. However, apparently it was very hard to get into this school, so some think that parents felt that they had to sign these forms and allow it in order to keep their kid there. I can imagine that in the 50s there wasn't a lot of options, so that's truly sad, especially hearing that their only option was an extremely dirty school. In our number 9 spot, we have nuclear testing. In 1954, the US government started performing nuclear tests near the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. The US was performing a series of nuclear tests that they called Castle Bravo, and these tests unfortunately resulted in a yield larger than anticipated. This then led the government to create Project 4.1, where they decided to study how the humans, the Marshallese nearby, were affected by the explosion. Some believe that the explosion and its impact was all an accident, but some believe that the US government planned this so that they could study and see how these people would be affected. Many of the Marshallese people had radiation poisoning, and of course, as you can imagine, many developed cancer that is believed to be associated with the explosion. Beta burns were also seen after the incident. In our number 8 spot, we have electroshock therapy. Some of these experiments quite possibly could have been done by people that believe that they are doing some good, but they themselves are insane. Either that or they are evil, because to experiment on young ones in any way is truly sickening. Here we have a doctor in the 1960s named Dr. Loretta Bender, who worked at New York's Creedmoor Hospital, and she began a treatment that she believed to be a revolutionary treatment for kids with social issues. It was electroshock therapy. She would interview and analyze a young one in front of a large group of people, and she would apply pressure to their heads. Apparently, the people who would move were considered to have shown early signs of schizophrenia. It was said that she was not sympathetic to the young patients and that in her time she used this electroshock therapy on over 100 young ones. It is unknown how these young ones were affected long term. In our number 7 spot, we have the stuttering experiment. Here we have yet another experiment that makes my blood boil. I'll get to why in a bit. This test took place in 1939 by Wendell Johnson and Mary Tudor, and the purpose of this test was to analyze the psychology around why people stutter and or how it can be cured. These researchers experimented on 22 young orphans and separated them into 2 groups. One group got praise for how they spoke, and the other group got negative feedback. The group that got negative feedback had normal speaking orphans suddenly begin to develop speech problems that apparently they had for the rest of their lives. I myself have struggled with speaking in my past, and that is why I actually started pushing myself to be in front of the camera and practice. So it's definitely hard to hear about experiments like this that could truly make or break the confidence of a young person. So gross. In our number 6 spot, we have the prison transplants. From 1913 to 1951, there was a surgeon doctor at California's San Quentin prison by the name of Dr. Leo Stanley, who obviously had access to many patients in the prison, and so he began to start testing on them. The experiments would range from sterilization to potential treatments for the Spanish flu to performing transplant surgeries. The transplant surgeries would actually be testicle transplants using testicles of executed prisoners and sometimes from animals like goats, for example. Yeah, that is truly horrific and definitely evil, and arguably he should have been in this prison. Isn't it weird how many horrible prison guard or prison doctor stories there are out there about them mistreating the inmates? Something that I'm sure a lot of prisoners were imprisoned for. Makes you think. In our number 5 spot, we have the Guatemalan test subjects. From 1946 to 1948, the US government, the president of Guatemala, and the health ministry in Guatemala were all in cahoots with each other, and they began performing experiments on Guatemalans without their consent. They were made to participate. Doctors deliberately infected people with syphilis and sexually transmitted diseases to track their untreated natural progression. Holy moly. When you think about it, that was after the war and only 76 years ago. It would be naive to think that this would never happen again. These patients were only given antibiotics to help. This resulted in 30 deaths, however that is only what was documented. We don't actually know how many deaths actually occurred from this. It was only in 2010 that the US government made a formal apology for their involvement. In our number 4 spot, we have the Tuskegee experiment. This one is another experiment that is just simply so gross that it's hard to even talk about. In 1932, the US Public Health worked with the Tuskegee Institute to track the natural progression of untreated syphilis. 600 people from Alabama were experimented on and infected with syphilis, and of the group, 399 already had syphilis. None of them were told that they had a disease that was life-threatening. They were told that they would receive free health care for participating, free meals, and burial insurance. The study continued till 1972, long after a cure was found. Many passed away and got severely ill from this experiment. In 1997, the president at the time, Bill Clinton, apologized to those affected, and he called this the most infamous biomedical experiment in US history. That was said in 1997 though, so I'm sure there have been more famous worldwide biomedical experiments now that perhaps we, the public, are just not aware of yet. If it took 25 years to get a formal apology and for it to become public knowledge, then who knows what we might discover and get an apology for in the future. In our number 3 spot, we have the mosquito experiment. How more people don't know about these experiments is truly beyond me. This one is deeply shocking to hear, so brace yourself. In 1956 and 1957, the US Army, aka the government because it would have had to have been approved, conducted a series of experiments on Florida, Georgia, and Savannah where they released millions of infected mosquitoes in order to see if insects could spread yellow fever. Of course, they learned that yes, they can, as many people contracted fevers, serious respiratory problems, stillbirths, typhoid, and much more. Apparently, to take it another step further, in order to get photo evidence of the experiment, researchers acted as health workers so they could see the patients. Many died from this experiment, as you can imagine. I wonder if there are any long-term effects for the people in these areas. I guess that's info I'm sure we'll never know. It's probably kept in top secret places like Area 51, let's be real. In our number 2 spot, we have Korean experimentation. Allegedly, there have been a ton of North Korean experiments over the years on prisoners. One experiment that has been spoken about was one where 50 female prisoners, all of good health, were given poisoned cabbage leaves. Apparently, within the hour, all had died. Allegedly, they also do experimental surgeries without anesthesia, starve them, and at times gas entire families. It is rumored that there is a van called The Crow where people are taken every month for these experiments. I truly hope that this is something from the past, but I know that there will always be evil in the world as much as we all wish there wasn't, so I wouldn't be surprised to hear that this is possibly something that still happens, and I truly hope it isn't. In our number 1 spot, we have Navy volunteers. In 1943, young men who were in the Navy were basically tricked into volunteering themselves to be gassed. This happened in the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington in the US. They were told that this experiment might help shorten the war, and so of course they wanted to do their duty and help. They were exposed to mustard gas, which of course was a deadly gas that was actively used in World War I. They were only told what they were participating in once the experiment was about to start. All of the soldiers suffered severe external and internal burns. All of the people were allegedly silenced and threatened by the Navy, and it wasn't until the 90s, when the documents were declassified, was this experiment taken to Congress.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Manhattan Project. Some of you guys may recognize the name of this one. It was the secret name for America's project to produce the atomic bombs that brought World War II to an end. Harry Daghlian was a young physicist who worked on the project. During an experiment on August 21st, 1945, he was attempting to build a neutron reflector manually by stacking a set of 4.4 kilogram tungsten carbide bricks in an incremental fashion around a plutonium core. Unfortunately, he dropped a brick which set off a chain reaction. He tried to stop the reaction, but by the time it was over, he received a high dose of neutron radiation. Harry received intense medical care for severe radiation poisoning. His mother and sister even flew out to New Mexico to care for him, but Harry fell into a coma. He died 25 days after the accident. His death resulted in new safety regulations when handling radioactive material. Next up at number 9 now, we have the dioxin tests. In 1965, dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman conducted a study on behalf of the US Army and some pharmaceutical companies. They wanted to know how human skin reacts to harsh chemicals, a process known as hardening. Most of the information about these tests has since been destroyed or just covered up. We do know that he described his patients as acres of skin to experiment on. We also know he used dioxin on them, the active ingredient in Agent Orange. This happened around the time the US was covering Vietnam with Agent Orange in an attempt to push the fight against the Viet Cong in their favor. To speed up the experiments, Dr. Kligman injected his victims with a reported 468 times the recommended safe dose of dioxin. After that, not much more has been uncovered. It's thought there are still about 70 of the patients out there still. Their identities and current condition are known. Next up at number 8 now, we have Operation Sea Spray. In September 1950, the US Navy spent 6 days spreading the bacterium Surretetia marcescens into the air about 2 miles off the coast of California. That bacterium lives in soil and water and is best known for its ability to produce a bright red pigment. This trait makes it useful in experiments because it's so bright, it's very easy to see where it is. The project was called Operation Sea Spray. Its aim was to determine the susceptibility of a big city like San Francisco to a bioweapon attack by terrorists. In the following days, the military took samples of 43 sites to track the bacteria's spread. They found that it had infested the whole city and all the surrounding suburbs as well. During the test, residents of San Francisco inhaled millions of bacterial spores. The military deemed the experiment a success. They got to see how far chemical warfare could spread, and anyway, they knew the bacterium wasn't harmful, or so they thought. People started getting urinary tract infections, and it was even linked to the death of a patient recovering from prostate surgery. This experiment wasn't even public knowledge until 1976, a full 26 years after the event. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Project MK Ultra. This is a particularly famous one that you guys may have heard me talk about in a previous video. During the 1950s and 60s, at the height of the Cold War, war, the US feared that communist countries were using mind control techniques to brainwash US prisoners of war in Korea. They wanted in on the action. So in response, the CIA authorized Project MKUltra in 1953. The secret operation was aimed at developing a defense against drugs or other manipulators that could control human behavior. Such was the secrecy of this project that even today, not much is known about it. But we do know this: the project involved more than 150 human experiments involving psychedelic drugs, paralytics, and electroshock therapy. Sometimes the test subjects were aware they were participating in a study, but shockingly, many did not, even when the hallucinogenic effects started kicking in. Can you even imagine how scary that would be? Many of the tests took place at universities, hospitals, or prisons in the US and Canada between 1953 and 1964. The CIA didn't keep many records though, and any good ones were destroyed when the program came to an official end in 1973. Moving on to number 6 now, we have North Korea. Some of the things we've all heard about North Korea may not be true, but some of them may be even worse than we could ever imagine. In 2014, a former North Korean officer stepped forward to say that the nation's military were using mentally and physically disabled children as test subjects in chemical experiments. He said this was the last straw that caused him to defect and leave the country. The man was called Im Cheon-young, and he said he was taken to special training at the military academy. It was there where they taught him how to confuse the enemy without revealing your own forces, how to carry out assassinations, and how to use chemical weapons. He was close to defecting on this alone, and then came the field learning. This involved testing biological and chemical weapons on so-called objects. At first, these objects were mice, but soon they were using humans. Im said that he saw with his very own eyes disabled people, sometimes children, being killed by these chemical weapons just to show the soldiers how they worked. One expert said this is not surprising. Anyone who visits the capital will never see disabled people because they are allegedly taken away as children and incarcerated in special camps. Perhaps these evil experiments are what the camps are all leading up to. Moving on to number 5 now, we have Project QKHILLTOP. This was a CIA project developed to study Chinese brainwashing techniques, which they used to develop new methods of interrogation. The research was led by a man named Dr. Howard Wolf. Now, he was a researcher at Cornell University's medical school. Dr. Wolf requested the CIA provide him with information on imprisonment, deprivation, humiliation, torture, brainwashing, hypnosis, and more. Based on this, the team began to formulate a plan. They wanted to develop secret drugs and various brain-damaging procedures. According to a letter that he wrote, in order to fully test the effects of this, Wolf wanted the CIA to make available suitable subjects. Once they had provided these poor souls to test on, Wolf also detailed the next step his research team would take. They would then assemble, collate, analyze, and assimilate the information, and will then undertake experimental investigations designed to develop new techniques of offensive, defensive intelligence using a potentially useful secret drug. Basically, the whole thing is just the stuff of nightmares. I have no idea how this got through. Nothing more is really known about the test subjects, or victims as they are often referred to now. Moving up to number 4 now, we have Dr. Loretta Bender. This doctor has gone down in history for her experiments on children. She was a child psychiatrist who specialized in children believed to have schizophrenia. For almost 3 decades, from 1942 to 1969, she was a highly respected expert in her field. Her preferred choice of treatment was electroshock therapy. These days, the practice has been banned in most of the world as it's seen as ineffective, cruel, and borderline torture in some cases. Still, this was a different time, and that's what Dr. Bender did to the children. Her methods involved interviewing and analyzing a sensitive child in front of a large group of people. She would then apply a gentle amount of pressure to the child's head. The theory was any child who moved with the pressure was showing early signs of schizophrenia. These days, that's referred to as total pseudoscience, but it took a while to figure that out. By the time her treatments were shut down, Bender had used electroshock therapy on over 100 children, the youngest of whom was just age 3. Reports described her as uncaring and the study as unethical. The shocks can cause memory loss, nausea, headaches, jaw pain, or even serious heart trouble, even in kids. Some say all of this was a result of Bender's misunderstood childhood that she had, and she was the product of her own environment and family. Now that is proper psychology. I'm just saying. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Burke and Hare murders. William Burke is a guy who has probably tainted my surname forever. Along with William Hare, these two men from Northern Ireland were famous grave robbers in Scotland. One day, an old man they knew died, and to cover his outstanding debt to them, they decided to sell his body for medical science. Edinburgh University gave them £7 and 10 shillings, a handsome sum in those days. With that, they were hooked. When another associate they knew fell ill, they couldn't even wait to see if he would die, and so they suffocated him in his bed. Again, they sold his body to the university for money. The killing spree began. The pair murdered and sold bodies almost as their full-time jobs. They killed an old grandmother with an overdose of painkillers. Hare even killed his own blind grandson by breaking his back across his knee. Eventually though, their whole operation was discovered when they got too sloppy. William Burke was hanged in front of a cheering crowd of over 25,000 people. Fittingly, after being put on public display, his body was donated to medical science. Next up at number 2 now, we have J. Marion Sims. This doctor was once praised as the father of modern gynecology. Now his reputation has been tarnished forever. It was found that he practiced these surgical techniques that made him famous on enslaved women. They included Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. The rest of them are unknown. He performed 30 surgeries on Anarcha alone, all without anesthesia. His legacy has long been questioned for the disturbing ethical questions that it raises, especially by those who believe that he used black women as medical guinea pigs without their consent. The Black Youth Project 100, a group of activists aged between 18 and 35, staged protests at a statue of Sims in New York. They wore hospital gowns splashed with red paint dripping down their legs. In a Facebook post, they explained that Sims had purchased black women slaves and used them as guinea pigs for his untested surgical experiments. He repeatedly performed genital surgery on black women without anesthesia because, according to him, black women don't feel pain. Despite his very inhumane tests on black women, Sims was named the father of modern gynecology, and his statue currently stands right outside the New York Academy of Medicine. And finally, number 1 now, we have the pregnant women. In January 2018, it emerged that after the Second World War, the US military gave nearly 1,000 pregnant women radioactive iron by their doctors without their knowledge. This was all part of a series of experiments to test the effects. Between 1945 and 1947, researchers at Vanderbilt University conducted this sick experiment that was funded by the US Public Health Service. All of the women were poor and had no knowledge of the experiment whatsoever. Afterwards, they were not even informed that they had been part of the study either. The radioactive iron was given as part of a medical cocktail by health officials that they trusted. Their aim was to record the absorption of iron during pregnancy. However, in the years since then, investigators have said this too was a lie, and that the real reason was for the military to learn more about radiation exposure. In the 1990s, Vanderbilt University finally acknowledged and investigated the experiments. The story broke when 2 women and one of their daughters filed a lawsuit against the university for exposing them to radiation. One of the women was Emma Kraft. She said at a Senate hearing that the experiments caused the death of her 11-year-old daughter due to cancer. The true effects of this study are still being investigated today. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Milgram experiment. If any of you guys have studied psychology at school, you've probably heard of this one. Stanley Milgram was a psychologist who conducted a study in America to see how far people would go when obeying an authority figure. The participants were told they were to give small electric shocks to other participants behind a wall every time they answered a question incorrectly. In reality, the electric shocks were fake and the other participants were just actors. Amazingly, even when the fake test subjects screamed out in pain, many of the participants would continue to administer what would have been fatal electric shocks just because the doctor urged them to continue. Many of the people involved in this claim they were traumatized for life, and the study has been ethically criticized in the years since. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the Challenger explosion. On January 28, 1986, the NASA Space Shuttle Challenger launched from Florida. On board were 5 astronauts and 2 payload specialists who were going to conduct research in space. 73 seconds into the flight, the ship broke apart and disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean. There were no survivors. After an investigation, it was determined that the fault lied with the design of the shuttle's O-rings. This was a problem which NASA had actually known about for almost 10 years, but those higher up in the organization had refused to listen to the concerns of engineers who thought a disaster like this could happen. The shuttle program was stopped for almost 3 years while investigations and improvements were made. Next up at number 8 now, we have the air crash. Jean-Francois de Rosier was a French teacher of physics and chemistry during the late 18th century. He also had a passion for aviation and conducted many experiments using a hot air balloon. Eventually, he decided to push the balloon to its limit by attempting to cross the English Channel. On the 15th of June 1785, his attempt ended in disaster when the balloon was blown off course and deflated at a height of 1,500 feet. De Rosier was killed and his wife died 8 days later from suspected suicide. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Unit 731. This was a secret unit of the Japanese army during World War II that carried out horrific experiments on civilians and prisoners. It's estimated that the project involved 250,000 men, women and children. Most of them were Chinese, along with some prisoners of war from Russia and the Allies. The procedures conducted on the patients included cutting them open without anesthesia, unnecessary amputations, and removal of organs such as the brain, liver and lungs. Others were used for weapons testing and died to grenades or flamethrowers. The true extent of the suffering is still being discovered today. Next up, number 6 now, we have the X-ray. Clarence Madison Daly was Thomas Edison's assistant. Now you might know Thomas Edison as the inventor of the light bulb, but he is also known for his work on X-rays. In the early days of X-ray researching, nobody realized just how dangerous they could be without taking the proper precautions. Daly acted as Edison's test subject and ended up getting radiation damage to his hands and face that required him to take time off work. At first, one of his hands was amputated and then 4 fingers on the other. Eventually, the cancer spread and he needed both arms amputated before eventually dying. He is thought to be the first American to die from the effects of experimentation with radiation. After this, Thomas Edison abandoned his research on X-rays, stating, "Don't talk to me about X-rays, I am afraid of them." Alright, next up at number 5 now, we have the nuclear bomb. In 1934, scientist Enrico Fermi bombarded uranium with neutrons and created what he thought was a new artificial element in the periodic table. He won a Nobel Prize for his work. Over the next few years, scientists began to realize that what had actually happened was that the uranium atom had been split in two. This had the potential to release huge amounts of energy that could be used for power or to build a devastating bomb. During World War II, the US set up the Manhattan Project to explore this option. It took just a few years for them to perfect the bomb. 2 of them were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing 150,000 people and many more from radiation. Japan surrendered soon after, bringing an end to World War II. Some scientists who worked on the first studies of nuclear fission were horrified that their discoveries had been used for such violence. Others felt it was the only way to end that war. Next up at number 4 now, we have Carl Scheele. He was a Swedish and German chemist who made a number of chemical discoveries during the late 18th century. These include the likes of molybdenum, tungsten, manganese and chloride. Unfortunately, Scheele liked to taste the new chemicals that he had discovered. Any chemist will tell you this is probably not a good idea, especially when one of his discoveries was hydrogen cyanide, the key word there being cyanide. Eventually the experiments caught up to him and Scheele died aged 43 from symptoms that resembled mercury poisoning. Moving on to number 3 now, we have Alexander Bogdanov. He was a Russian doctor and philosopher known for his work on blood transfusion. He used himself as the test subject and conducted 11 transfusions which he claimed had stopped his boarding and improved his eyesight. Bogdanov was a pioneer in blood transfusion, and that's the key thing to remember here, a pioneer. Nobody fully understood the dangers of it, including him. In 1928, he took a blood transfusion from a person infected with malaria and tuberculosis. As you might expect, he died shortly after. Next up at number 2 now, we have Joseph Mengele. To call these science experiments may not even be fair, some might just call them torture. Mengele was a Nazi doctor who carried out medical experiments on thousands of prisoners in concentration camps during the Holocaust. He would purposefully induce hypothermia, infect them with malaria, or force them to inhale mustard gas, all to just see the effects. He would also forcibly sterilize people and infect wounds with bacteria, as well as filling them with wood shavings and ground glass. He's perhaps most famous though for his obsession with twins. He was known to have once sewed 2 twins together in a twisted effort to create conjoined twins. And finally, number 1 now, we have Marie Curie. She is one of the most famous scientists of all time, and for good reason. Born in Poland, she went on to become the only scientist to ever win the Nobel Prize in 2 separate fields of study, chemistry and physics. She studied a number of radioactive isotopes and discovered the elements of polonium and radium. She also developed mobile radiography units to provide X-rays to field hospitals. Her work was groundbreaking, but as you might expect, radiation was not fully understood at the turn of the 20th century. Her constant exposure to this radiation led to her getting leukemia. She eventually died from aplastic anemia leukemia. Starting with number 10 now, we have David Reimer. When this Canadian man was born in 1965, he was sent to be circumcised, but the doctors experimented with an unconventional technique and ended up removing David's entire penis. Now, doctors told his parents the best solution would be to give him a sex change operation right there and then, raise him as a girl, and never let him know the truth. This ended up tearing his parents apart, and his dad told David the truth when he was 14. David then chose to get a reverse sex operation. It was a success. However, David struggled a lot with the events of his past and ended up committing suicide at just 38 years old. At number 9 now, we have the chimp baby. In the 1930s, a scientist called Winthrop Kellogg thought a chimp could grow up to be like a human if it lived alongside a human baby, his own son. For 9 months, he conducted experiments, and his son Donald was inseparable from the chimp called Gua. They ate together and they played together. They noticed that Gua was picking up more and more human tendencies from Donald than ever before, but the experiment came to an abrupt halt when Donald, the human baby, began to regress and become more like a chimp. Apparently, he would just sit there howling and wailing and would struggle to pick up even basic language like a normal human baby. The experiment was stopped immediately. Alright, at number 8 now, we have the monster study. This 1939 experiment was conducted on 22 orphans to see how children responded to positivity and negativity when it comes to speech therapy. Half the children were praised for their efforts, while the other half were teased and belittled for their speech imperfections. Many of the children who received this negative feedback went on to suffer serious psychological damage for the rest of their lives. It was so bad that some of them could barely even speak again. The monster study got its name from its shocking experimentation on orphan children just to prove a hypothesis. Alright guys, coming in at number 7 now, we have Tusko. This one was just messed up, if I'm honest. In 1962, when the CIA was absolutely obsessed with finding out the effects of LSD, they experimented on an elephant with the help of the University of Oklahoma. The elephant, called Tusko, weighed 3.5 tons and was given enough LSD to make 3,000 humans hallucinate. The CIA were trying to see if they could make the elephant enter must, which is a naturally occurring state where elephants become violent and uncontrollable. The experiment was a total disaster. Tusko almost immediately collapsed and had a seizure for almost 2 hours before finally dying. At number 6 now, we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. This psychology experiment conducted by Stanford University involved splitting 24 random students into 2 groups. One group were the prison guards and the others were their prisoners. This was set up for them to study how power and authority works within human groups, but it got really messed up. It was supposed to last 2 weeks, but had to be stopped after just 6 days because the guards began to abuse their power. They would emotionally and physically abuse the prisoners. After just the first day alone, the guards were already attacking them with fire extinguishers. Yeah. Some of them suffered serious mental and physical injuries for life. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the yellow fever experiment. Dr. Firth was a scientist who was trying to prove that yellow fever was not contagious and was actually due to the difference between summer and winter. Now, in an effort to prove this, he tried to infect himself with yellow fever by drinking the vomit of victims. He also injected it into his body and even poured it onto his eyes. Well, it turns out he was right about the whole seasonal thing, but for the wrong reason. It's mosquitoes that are the ones who spread yellow fever, and they hibernate in the winter. So all the vomit drinking and pouring in the eyes was for nothing. At the number 4 spot now, we have testicle radiation. In 1963, researchers offered prisoners in the Washington and Oregon area $25 to participate in reproductive radiation tests. Now, they were told they wanted to see how a normal dose of X-ray level radiation would affect a man's testicles. Instead, they hit them with about 6 times that amount of radiation. The prisoners, as you might expect, developed testicular cancer, they became sterile, and had many other health problems. The class action lawsuit only gave $2,000 to each of the victims. We're at the number 3 spot now, and we have TGN-1412. This was the name of an experimental drug used to treat leukemia. As with most drugs for humans, it was first tested on animals to see if it was non-fatal. It wasn't. In fact, everything was fine with the animals. They moved on to testing the drug on humans, and just to be safe, they gave them a dose 500 times lower than the level found safe in animals. 6 of the test subjects were hospitalized with massive organ failure. The trial was stopped, and researchers started to work on why this drug was fine in the animals but almost killed 6 humans that it was given to. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the Guatemala syphilis experiment. This experiment involved US-backed Guatemalan doctors infecting soldiers, prisoners, prisoners and prostitutes in Guatemala with syphilis in order to study it. They wanted to see what the effectiveness of penicillin was on syphilis, except they only used penicillin on about half of the 1,308 people involved in the study. At least 83 people died, and 63 years later, President Barack Obama apologized on behalf of the US to the Guatemalan president. And finally, at number 1 now, we have MK Ultra. This CIA experiment was conducted in the 50s and the 60s in an effort to see if LSD and other drugs could mind control people. They tested the drug on countless unwitting citizens. Some of them weren't even American. Many of them suffered life-altering mental conditions and became very unstable. Those that tried to speak out about what happened met mysterious deaths, such as suspicious suicides. Not surprisingly, most of the documents involved with these shocking experiments were later destroyed.